Good afternoon. My name is Mathias Risse, and I'm the director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it is my distinctive pleasure also on behalf of my colleague Sushma Raman, who is the executive director of the Carr Center, to welcome our distinguished speakers and you, our audience, to this episode in our series on the fierce urgency of now. On a weekly basis, the series addresses challenges that one way or another are matters of economic justice at the intersection to racial justice. And today our topic is human rights from the standpoint of a Human Rights Center, of course. That is a rather big topic and rather important topic at the intersection to economic and racial justice. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed on December 10th, 1948, and its passing marked a truly historical moment. In 30 articles, that declaration presents a range of protections and entitlements that span all domains of life, protections and entitlements meant to apply to all human beings that are presented to the world as a matter of shared and genuinely global responsibility. While it took a while for the Universal Declaration to start leaving its mark on the world over the decades, it has given rise to a broadly based international framework of human rights conventions and institutions. It has also affected domestic political movements in countless ways, as well as the design of legislation and constitutions around the world. And it has given rise to a flourishing international NGO scene devoted to human rights, and overall it has helped create a mindset among many millions of people around the world to the effect that human beings everywhere face similar challenges, that organized power is only justified to the extent that it helps people to meet these challenges, and that it is indeed a global responsibility to make sure that power everywhere is deployed in such ways. While the human rights language itself sits more comfortably with some traditions than with others, all major intellectual traditions around the world, regardless of whether they actually did that in terms of a rights language, included reflection on how to protect people from the capricious exercise of power and how to enable their flourishing. And the human rights language is a contemporary way of capturing ideas around such matters. The human rights movement tends to look at societies from the standpoint of the underdog, and in that spirit, the question only ever is how many human rights crises we currently face around the world and where. At the same time, it is also clear, and in large parts also simply a measurable fact, that human affairs would be in much worse shape had it not been for the human rights movement with all its institutional and motivational ramifications that we have so clearly witnessed over the decades. Our theme in this series, again, is economic and racial justice. As far as economic justice is concerned, one long-standing criticism of the human rights movement has been that it focuses too little on economic inequality, that it doesn't focus on relative economic status. And of this economic inequality, of course, we have so much these days that any kind of fair protection of human rights just seems to be out of reach in a world that allows a few dozen people to amass more wealth than hundreds of millions of people own together. And that, in the minds of many, has then led to the question of whether human rights have not become obsolete, given that now our focus should be to bring more economic justice into the world, that now our focus should be on actually defeating these incredible inequalities that are around us. And as far as racial justice is concerned, the Universal Declaration takes non-discrimination so seriously that in its first two articles, it insists in different ways that indeed all human beings possess all human rights equally, regardless, that is, in particular, of race. So if you look at Article 1 and Article 2 of the Universal Declaration, you realize they pretty much say the same thing, once in a negative way and once in a positive way, to really make sure that the typical grounds for excluding people from rights protection that we have seen in so much political practice before is not interpreted into the Universal Declaration. So all of that is there. So in a way, you have heard about non-discrimination twice already on the Universal Declaration before you were even coming to something like a right to life. So that's how important non-discrimination, especially on racial grounds, is for the Universal Declaration. And yet there's little doubt that human beings continue to have enormous difficulties seeing eye to eye with each other across racial divides and to come to a shared understanding of the amount of evil that racism has brought into the world historically. And that would lead to the question of whether the human rights movement has actually helped with global racism or can help with global racism. Now, we are delighted to have with us today two distinguished guests with whom to discuss these matters, two guests who look at the human rights movement from rather different angles. First of all, I'm delighted to have with us Aminta Ossam, who is a colleague at Harvard Law School. She's a clinical instructor at the International Human Rights Clinic at the law school. Before that, before coming to Harvard, she was a human rights officer at the United Nations, where she supported the subcommittee on prevention of torture and also the special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council in fact-finding, advocacy, and training in different parts of the world, in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and also in Europe. Her work focuses on equality, inclusion, and economic and social rights. She also has research interests in human rights diplomacy, the role of identity and advocacy, and symbiosis between civil and human rights movements. And then our second guest for today, whom I'm delighted to welcome back to the Kennedy School, who's joining us from India, is Salil Shetty. National of India is a lifelong human rights activist who in particular served as the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2010 to 2018. During that time, he substantially increased Amnesty's standing as a global organization, among other things, by enhancing its presence in the global South. And thereby, by moving the operations of Amnesty to the global South, he also at least to strengthen them there quite substantially. He also emphasized the very active role of the Global South in the advancement of human rights. And he was a senior fellow here at the Carr Center from 2018 to 2019, when traveling was still possible without the constraints that have since become applicable. So it's great to see you again, Salil, if only on the screen. So we are delighted to have both of you with us today. And I will now first turn over to Aminta. She will speak for about 8 minutes or so, and then Salil will take over, and then at the Q&A stage, Sushma and I will enter or re-enter and have a conversation. And all of you out there on YouTube, please do put your questions into the YouTube channel. There we will be screening that also to pay attention to your questions. But now, without further ado, let me turn over to Aminta.
Thank you very much, Mathias, and thank you to the Carr Center for inviting me to this talk. I always have to give a disclaimer that I'm speaking on my personal capacity of my own personal opinions, but needless to say, I'm really passionate about this topic, particularly at looking at areas where demands for racial justice and economic justice are intersecting. So giving you some examples from the work that some of my clinical teams have worked on, we worked on, for example, the issue of rights in the workplace. So just looking only at COVID-19 in the United States, we know that the issue of rights in the workplace is both a racial and economic inequality issue. We know that people of color are disproportionately the ones who are in essential work, which gives them greater exposure to COVID-19 and health risks. It's people of color who are employed in greater numbers in industries like the hospitality industry that are affected by some of the responses to combat the virus, like travel restrictions or reductions. It's people of color who are often the face of precarious work that's less protected in times of economic crisis, and people of color working in precarious work are the ones who are risking not getting social support from their governments in the context of COVID-19. So the right to equitable work and safe working conditions is both an economic and a racial justice concern, in my opinion. Another topic that we've worked on is the rights to a healthy environment, which are under strain like never before, as we can see from the wildfires and increasing storms that we're facing in the United States. Communities of color are the ones who are greater exposed to issues like hazardous waste in their community. Communities of color are the ones with less resources to protect themselves from the harms of climate change. So for example, by being able to move or to adapt their physical environments. And it's communities of color who are disproportionately represented in the types of occupations that are most exposed to environmental harm. So if you think of people who are working outside, who work in agriculture and other fields that are exposed to impacts of temperature and climate change. So to me, this is also both a racial and economic justice concern. And most recently, I've started working on the issue of access to water, which another colleague of mine, Susan Farbstein, has also worked on in many different countries in the world. In the US, we are the wealthiest country in the world, but we still have 2 million people who don't have access to running water in their homes or adequate sanitation. Even more actually, people are relying on water that's not clean to do their cooking, bathing, just everyday life activities. And it's often Black and Brown communities that fall under this category. So when we're thinking about the economic impact of that, the impact is that if you don't have a basic need like water met, then that puts you behind when you're pursuing things like education and employment. So it's both a racial justice and an economic justice concern. And I would also say this is a human rights concern. So now I've asked myself, how well positioned is human rights to seek justice for these kinds of realities that sit at the intersection of racial and economic justice? I see different opportunities and challenges from my admittedly limited vantage point, but first I should say when I talk about human rights, I talk about it and it can mean a number of different things, as Mathias's introduction really eloquently touched on. So human rights is, for one, a body of law, which we work with obviously a lot at the law school. It's international conventions, constitutional provisions, particular pieces of legislation. Human rights are also institutions. When we think about international organizations, courts, and tribunals, sometimes we talk about human rights as a set of tools. So the methods by which advocates are pushing for change. In our clinic, we often use different things like investigation and reporting, litigation, pressing for law and policy reform. When we speak of human rights, we often think of a certain type of civil society actor. So organizations like Amnesty International, international organizations, and grassroots non-profit organizations. And human rights are also moral claims. That this is what the public often thinks about when we talk about human rights, the general beliefs about the inherent dignity of the human being and entitlements of human beings by nature of their being human. So I think on each of these vectors, there are different challenges and opportunities for pursuing economic justice for marginalized communities. So in terms of the law, I think the question of economic inequality per se is a bit tricky. I don't know of any treaty or constitution that says that differential income or differential wealth is in itself a human rights violation. And this is often what critics are talking about when they say that human rights law is not helpful for economic inequality. But I think there are opportunities on the other side of that. So as Mathias mentioned, racial discrimination is very clearly a human rights violation under international law. And so is discrimination on other grounds that often track with economic inequality. So when we think of discrimination based on disability, sexual orientation, gender, and accountability for economic inequality can be pursued through these lenses. In terms of institutions, I think one challenge that I see, again, from a limited vantage point, is that it's often not the same practitioners who are working on economic justice and racial justice. So issues that fall at the intersection are sometimes underexplored, and sometimes the topics are spoken about in contrast to each other, or issues are independently of each other, let's say. I think there are opportunities that institutions are taking advantage of. So, for example, human rights organizations and institutions are increasingly drawing on multidisciplinary expertise to prove violations of human rights. So, for example, working with economists, scientists, and social scientists to show where progress has or hasn't happened in terms of socioeconomic inequality. On the tools, there's a lot of technical discussion that can be had on different human rights methodologies, but one thing I can say is that a lot of the tools that we use are flowing from the law, so they're directly responding to the law. For example, fact finding in order to prove a specific human rights violation under a particular convention. So to the extent that the law is limited in how it determines whether economic inequality is a violation, the tools can also be limited. But I think the opportunities in that regard are that organizations are constantly testing and retesting and retooling and pushing for changes of law in order to address economic injustice. On the civil society front, one thing that I've confronted has been the fact that human rights organizations have a specific position vis-a-vis political processes. So civil society organizations tend to want to be politically neutral, particularly when it's a topic concerning economic redistribution of resources. So unlike other social justice organizations that may align with particular political parties, human rights organizations tend not to be in a position to do that. But I do see that human rights organizations are partnering with a lot of different social justice organizations to better understand the causes and symptoms of economic inequality so that they can partner together to challenge them. So for example, collaborations with trade associations, environmental activists, social movements, and anti-corruption campaigners are what I think of in this regard. And then on moral principles, I won't get into this because I fear getting into this with a philosopher on the line as well. But I will say that the idea of economic and racial justice being a human rights concern more generally persists. So we see that people are speaking about human rights when they talk about healthcare, jobs, even in protests and in lobbying for litigation change, the language of human rights is still evoked. To pursue economic and racial justice, which to me means something and should be a cause for inspiration. So I'll stop there and pass it to Salil. Thanks.
Thank you, Amita. That's very good. I'm trying to figure out
So it looks like Salil lost his connection. So hopefully he will be, and it was extra frustrating since he said I was just trying to figure out, and we were hoping to hear what he was trying to figure out, and then his connection collapsed. Aminta, do you want to just say a few more things while we're waiting for
we could also just ask her a couple of questions.
Yeah, maybe if you have some questions.
Also, so the one thing that I've been meaning that I would have asked you and Salil both later is this is a precarious time in American politics, right? So we have a transition. We do have a transition from one administration to another. This is also a time of record keeping, looking back, looking forward. So your take on the record of this administration, Aminta, what stands out? The Trump administration, what stands out to you about its human rights record, and where do you hope that things will be different in the near future with the new administration, the Biden administration coming in?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from a personal standpoint as someone who's the daughter of immigrants, who is a person of color, who is a woman. We often feel like our communities have been under attack under the current administration, and that our voices haven't been included. And I think what we hear from our communities and also from our students is a sense of exhaustion and despair and a sense of fear, actually, that we might be made to seem as if we are not part of the American experiment. But I think one thing I could hope for is that we will start having a language which values diversity, and that value will also translate to policies that will further protect our communities, because I think the erosion of human rights is a really tangible impact on each of our lives. and, I even think now about my international students and some of the concerns that they've said to me, and my own family members, and all the things that that others are going through. So I think, I think there's a misconception that just changing from one administration to another means that human rights are over. We don't have to make human rights demands. So I definitely don't believe that, human rights advocates should be sitting on our hands in this transition, but I do hope that there is a more inclusive language, which sets the tone for the country and has a direct impact on each of us.
Thank you. Salila was just asking Aminta to elaborate a little bit on how she sees the human rights situation in the United States at the stage that we're making the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. The last thing that we heard you say, Salila, is I'm trying to figure out, and then your connection collapsed. So we're now eager to hear what you figured out in the meantime.
Well, I figured out how to get back onto this meeting. I think that's what's happened, but apologies for that. And I was saying that, I think that the deep differences in approach between a broader sort of justice-based approach to human rights and a narrower law-based approach to human rights, I think is really at the kind of root of the confusion as we have these conversations. But so let me, within the narrower confines of a kind of international human rights discourse and law-based kind of understanding, even there the problems begin at inception, right? At the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, the discourse at one level was that it's indivisible, interdependent, that economic, social, cultural rights goes hand in hand, that two sides of the same coin with civil and political rights. But then we had two separate covenants, and never the twain shall meet. And so we had the kind of political argument right from the beginning, from the sort of capitalist West, so to speak, pushing for civil political rights, and the communist bloc pushing for economic, social rights. And I think the developing world slightly confused in some ways, because on the one hand, they were all coming out from or moving into a kind of political independence. So freedom was very, very important. But at the same time, obviously, for poor countries, economic rights were very, very important as well. But the communist bloc's sequencing idea didn't have that much purchase, because their view was that economic, social rights should come first, which is what the Chinese would still say even as we speak. And then it got mixed up with the whole issue of sovereignty. So as soon as you speak about civil political rights, regimes who are abusing human rights will start talking about, about sovereignty. And then as soon as you talk about economic justice, poor countries will first start talking about aid flows and technology transfer. So that debate goes on as we speak. Now, economic justice itself, as far as I'm concerned, can be seen in so many different ways. You can look at it intra-country, within countries. You can look at it between countries. And when you look at the whole issue of economic injustice or justice within countries, that takes you squarely into the discrimination discussion, because most of the issues there will be based on race, gender, caste, ethnicity, religion. So, you're already straight into that discussion on, that indivisibility issue comes straight in your face. And I think, as you know, the race issue and the gender-based discrimination issue came later on, what was called kind of third generation rights through CEDAW and CERD and all the conferences which followed, Beijing and Johannesburg, etc. The other dimension which I wanted to bring to the attention of all of us is the whole angle of the discussion on development, because interestingly, the development speak doesn't talk about rights largely. It talks about economic justice, but it talks less about rights. And then the international NGOs had tried to find a fix by talking about rights-based development, whatever that means. So there's a lot of talk about rights-based development, and now the Sustainable Development Goals are now trying to bring together, everything. It's all kind of coming into one thing. So there's human rights, there's civil, political, economic, social, environmental justice, all rolled into one. But the quandary of the human rights NGOs is much more complex. The development NGOs kind of sorted it out by bringing in the concept of rights-based development. And not just development NGOs, but development agencies, including bilateral cooperation, started talking more and more about rights-based development. But the human rights folks struggled a great deal. For example, those of you who followed Amnesty's history, Amnesty almost was torn apart into two in 1990, when the whole discussion on whether they should expand their mandate from civil political rights to what was called full spectrum. It was the Dakar Global Assembly in 1990, which almost split the organization into two. And even, so when I went in much later in mid 2000, I'd say that there was not that much work. So there was a kind of policy decision that Amnesty will work on full spectrum, but on the ground, there was actually very little economic, social, cultural rights work going on. And that's because it's a very complex set of questions that was being discussed internally, because what happens is, as you know, typically in human rights, legal sort of legalese, you need to have a clear, perpetrator, you need to have a clear victim, you should be able to establish the kind of linkage between the two, and you don't really go too much into causality, because as soon as you go into causality, then, like, for example, economic models, what is the right model, what's the wrong model, that's not something which human rights folks are ready to go into, because there's no one answer to that question. And human rights folks like to have one answer to the question largely. So that's made it very complicated. Equally, I think it's also, the human rights organizations, NGOs particularly, and I would say even the entire human rights fraternity would say that our take on human rights violations is neutral, not just to economic system, but also to political systems, because you have, so-called democracies violating human rights. And as much as, say, communist autocratic governments do that. And similarly, you have capitalist economies violating human rights, and you have, whatever you call them, non-market based economic systems. So I think there's a fundamental tension there between, what's a model. When you go into these model questions, it becomes a much more conflicted discussion, I think. But, in a sense, all of this is a little bit theoretical, because what I've always found bizarre is that, for anybody who comes from a developing country, this discussion does sound a little bit bizarre, because, as far as, the way we've grown up, what happens is that if you don't have a voice, and I'm using voice as a shorthand for civil and political rights, you tend to be poor. And I'm using that as a shorthand for economic, social, cultural rights. And conversely, if you're poor, you have no voice. So it literally comes together in that simple sort of way. And so in India, you cannot find a clearer example than India, because if you look at the economic disadvantages that people face, and you then correlate it with caste, you correlate it with gender, you correlate it with race, with indigenous communities, with women, Dalits, it's a one-to-one correlation. I mean, there's almost no exception. So, the so-called intersectionality it's staring you in your face, so we can have whatever discussions we want about the theoretical basis and the legal basis, but it is very, very obvious, So I think the law-based definition becomes too narrow for this discussion. And at the end of the day, law is also going to be determined only by politics in a social political context. So I think that's where we are. And you can also, I think, as Aminta tried to do, if you start looking at other sort of way, you can look at the same thing. We can look at it from an economic cut, but if you also look at it from the point of view of, say, for example, pretrial detention. I mean, the US and India are two sort of champions in terms of the number of people we incarcerate and keep in our jails. And even the most basic analysis of who is in jail. I mean, in the US, it's mostly Black people, and in India, it's mostly Dalits and Muslims. I mean, it's there for you to see. You take death row, death penalty, similar sort of patterns. So you can look at it anyway. And if you take some, real life issue, say the Rohingya issue that, the world was shocked to face. We've now already forgotten it, and Aung San Suu Kyi is back with a huge majority. But I mean, at the time, it shook the world. And even today, they're sitting in camps. And who are the Rohingyas? I mean, you want to look at intersectionality of class, religion, gender, every one of those things that we're discussing, it's staring you in the face, So I think, and the pandemic, I think Aminta mentioned the issue of the pandemic. In India, we don't have that much of disaggregated data, but whatever little we've seen, it massively, disproportionately affects those who are of particular race, caste, religion, gender. So I can also talk a lot more, but I think I'll stop there. I had several examples which I could come back to in our discussion maybe later on about, where particularly when we looked at corporate accountability and the role of companies, it's another area where it's quite shocking. When you start looking at the economic questions, the social, the racial, they all come together. But I think I'll pause and we can come back to that in a minute. Thank you.
Thank you both, Aminta and Salil, for your remarks. A lot of questions on our minds, but we also encourage you, our audience, to post your questions in the chat, and we will be drawing upon them in today's conversation. So one question I have for both of you really is that, around the world, human rights are under attack. Authoritarian rulers around the world, people who are not willing to have their track records criticized by foreign entities. And of course, even within academia and within human rights organizations, there's a lot of conflict over what kinds of issues should be prioritized, how to deal with technological change, climate change, and so on. So I guess my question for both of you is, given this landscape, does it make sense to push the human rights movement and human rights organizations to think of models that can really be inclusive of economic equity and racial equity? Or is it better to ensure that the existing human rights efforts that have been underway are strengthened and bolstered?
Maybe I can start on it because I actually don't have a very strong opinion on this. And interestingly enough, one of our visiting fellows is actually doing some writing on this actual question, and even looking at whether it should be an approach where we say human rights organizations should just do what they're doing and give space to other actors who work on economic inequality. This is another alternative argument that people have had. I don't personally have a very strong preference, but I do want to complicate the problem by saying that there are human rights organizations that have worked in the space of seeking economic justice. One of the partners that I work with, for example, the Center for Economic and Social Rights, has done a lot of budget analysis, a lot of advocacy on human rights and fiscal policy and what implications that may have. And also, I think there are organizations that are doing a lot of partnerships with other types of institutions, like I mentioned, these working with social justice organizations of all kinds. So there's some activities that human rights organizations have been really good at, which can be put in service of organizations that work for economic justice. So for example, the issue of participation or the issue of protecting human rights defenders has been used to push governments to protect people who already work on the issue of anti-corruption, for example, on environmental human rights defenders. So it's not necessarily to say that human rights organizations need to become specialists themselves in the environment or in anti-corruption, but they can already support the work of others who are doing that. And we have been working on climate change and looking at a lot of jurisprudence around human rights as applied to the environment. One of the big cases in the African system was a case that the Center for Economic and Social Rights brought with SERAC, an NGO in Nigeria, which greatly expanded the way that we envision the right to life, saying that it's not only about an immediate cessation of your life, but also environmental degradation that leads to poor health, which can lead to shorter lifespan, can be a violation of the right to life. So I think that I think that human rights organizations have already done some work which is pushing for economic justice and for remedying the symptoms of economic injustice. But I don't have a strong opinion on the specific question of whether they should differ or increase their specialization.
No, I think that Mathias kind of referred to the same point in the beginning, Sushma, I think, which is to say that, should human rights organizations do more, on economic justice given the times we are in, but that makes it sound like we've sorted out the social and racial injustice issue. Now let's focus on economic injustice. And that's kind of, he's looking at me quizzically, so maybe that's not what you meant, Mathias, but I'm just saying that, the challenge we have is that, it kind of then we fall into this trap of an either or situation. My point is that the two simply shouldn't be seen as separate because they're not separate. They're so deeply interlinked, and we have to understand that one is, joined by the hip with the other, So, and therefore we just need to include that in our analytical framework and not choose between one or the other. We are dealing with both the issues. Very interesting, as Sushma will recognize this, in the Bihar election in India, which we just finished yesterday, the leading opposition party campaigned on the issue of unemployment, which has never been an election issue before. And you can't find a greater economic justice question than employment, right? And his party has historically been the party which has fought on social justice. And he's a 31-year-old guy who almost became the chief minister yesterday. He just lost. They're still the single largest party. And the point that he was making is exactly what, in a sense, Mathias is saying. The era of social justice over. We spent 30 years fighting that fight. Now we are fighting for economic justice. But I don't think that's the case. I think that the two, unfortunately, are so deeply interlinked. But the other point, Sushma, which you made was about these, what I call elected authoritarians, the Modis, Dutertes, Erdogans, and Trumps and the like, Bolsonaros. I think that's not the same challenge, at least not in my head. I mean, I know that one of the things they're doing is to attack human rights as a discourse, and delegitimize it. But that is, that is partly because their entire basis for them to build their political capital and to build their political base is by attacking Muslims, refugees, Dalits, women. So, attacking the human rights of the weakest sections of the population is the basis on which they gain support from their political base. So in that sense, they have to delegitimize human rights discourse, So I think, and they're not just bashing human rights discourse, they're bashing, anything scientific, anything intellectual, any kind of dissent. So everything is tarred with the same brush. So I don't think that human rights organizations should therefore rethink their strategy because these people are delegitimizing that. I think quite the converse. I think we should deepen up and strengthen it. There's lots of things we need to do differently, but that's a different conversation.
Thank you. Salil, let me actually follow up with the question that I earlier asked Aminta when your connection was a moment, namely about your perspective on the human rights situation specifically in the United States. So we are now in this transitional period. Donald Trump was voted out of office. We have Joe Biden, incoming president Joe Biden. So from your perspective, how do you think this period, the Trump administration, will go into the annals of the human rights movement? What stands out, and what needs to change? What are you hoping will change most urgently, most immediately once Joe Biden is in the White House in January? You are muted still.
I was just saying that, my brain is rewired in the last 2 years to focus on India. And so my focus is what are the implications of what's happening in the US for India rather than what needs to happen inside the US. There's lots more people in the room who know a lot more about that than I do. And yeah, that's a very, very important question that, we are trying to figure out because, it's not like the Obama administration took a very strong view on what was happening in India and took a progressive view. They didn't because with this new geopolitical drama between India and China, keeping India happy has become a big task for any of the Western powers, right? So because that's the only way they can offset China up to a point, and India is too big a market as well. So when the massive human rights violations in India, will the Biden-Harris administration speak up? Is a moot point, and so although Kamala Harris herself has spoken up on 2 or 3 important issues like Kashmir and the anti-CAA agitation where so many people were attacked and arrested, will they do that into the next phase is a big question. The one thing I can say is that what Trump did and the kind of playbook that he followed was a huge inspiration for authoritarian rulers in so many other parts of the world. So his departure, I think, does signal, does give some hope and inspiration for people who are resisting elected authoritarianism in many other parts of the world. Will this translate into real action? As you know, Biden has announced that they're going to hold a global summit for democracy. I don't hold my breath with summits, but at least it kind of signals that they are going to speak up on these issues. And it's not just about Russia and China, but now we have too many other countries. The most recent one was Tanzania, which had another landslide victory. So, and there's so many countries now with this. This is a kind of a pattern which is growing in so many parts of the world. So I would say that there's a lot of hope and expectations, almost too much hope and expectation from the changes in the US, both inspired by the resistance from young people and everything that's happened bottom up, and now that these people are in power, that they are going to stand up against the authoritarians.
Thank you. Let me ask a question of both of you. In a few minutes back, this issue of delegitimizing the human rights discourse came up already, and I also tried to say something about that in my introductory words about how there is a certain burden of proof on the human rights movement also to make a positive case, right, for the legitimacy of the human rights movement. And this often happens along two dimensions. So the critics come along two dimensions, and the positive case needs to happen along two dimensions. There's first of all the one concern about legitimacy or human rights is really it's a Western thing, a thing from the global North, and it was the ways in which it came to other parts of the world. There's something very dubious about that, and that is still kind of just delegitimizing, or at least throwing shadows of doubt over the human rights movement. That is one way in which this goes, and the other way in which this goes is that the human rights movement, the framework, doesn't really make enough of a difference. So there's been a lot of critical literature about this in recent years. People saying, we have been doing this now for 70 plus years, it's not doing enough good in the world. It's tried to do, I don't know, something else, but in any event, there would be a legitimacy deficit. And that, of course, especially the first part about the global North part, it's very interesting to hear from both of you, since Aminta, you mentioned your family's from Nigeria, and Salil, you are from India, and you are both in the human rights movement. So you must have both a lot of experience with both of these dimensions of legitimacy seeking criticism. So maybe Aminta, you can speak to this legitimacy issue first. How do you normally handle that? And then we'll go back to Salil.
Okay, yeah, from my perspective, I tend to resist this argument, not only because I'm from a family from the Global South, but because I've worked with so many activists, so many advocates from the Global South who have, and even diplomats from the Global South who have played an equal role in determining what human rights are and how human rights are advanced. So, for example, thinking of one issue I talked about before on the issue of human rights having a role to play in fiscal policy, it's a lot of Latin American scholars and activists who push that. Had I not personally worked for activists who have worked who are of Indian descent or from India, I wouldn't know myself that India itself has a very strong constitutional tradition on economic and social rights, like we're talking about now. So if you only think of human rights as coming from the West, that kind of ignores the contributions that many countries and individuals have made to what human rights is today. Another issue I think of is disability rights, something that I've worked on in the past. A lot of Central American countries have pushed this issue and have helped to create a convention now on that. So I tend to not agree with this argument that human rights is only a Western product.
Yeah. So, Sushma, if I should go on in terms of responding to the same question, good, Mathias is here as well. So I absolutely, I mean, I completely agree with, I think it's the weakest argument, and we don't want to go down that rabbit hole of trying to defend, this issue of not invented here. But it reminds me of a story from Egypt. Mathias, when Mubarak was unseated and the Supreme Council of Armed Forces took power in Egypt, I took an amnesty delegation to meet them because we had so much of evidence against Mubarak at the time. We wanted to talk to the Egyptian government about what we could share with them, etc. And so after waiting for 3 days, they finally gave us a meeting with a member of SCAF. SCAF had 9 members at that time, and they gave us a meeting with the head of military intelligence. His name is Sisi, later on became the president of Egypt, still is. So we had the most bizarre meeting with Sisi, and the issue that we went to talk to him about specifically was that, can the Supreme Council of Armed Forces put an end to the whole issue of virginity testing? I don't know if you've heard of this thing called virginity testing. They have this bizarre thing where, the women who are inside prisons and inside the Mukhabarat, which is where the investigations happen, have to go through virginity testing before they're released so they can prove that the soldiers had not raped these women. So, but I'm giving you this story because Sisi started by, so when I raised this question, Sisi's answer was, you don't understand Egyptian culture, So, so this is kind of the classic thing, Egyptians don't believe in this human rights thing. We have a different culture. As it happened, we had already met the women who had gone through virginity testing, Salima, the whole group. And so, the answer to Sisi was, so which culture are you talking about? I mean, the women who've been through virginity testing do not think that this is acceptable. They think this is a human rights abuse. Now you're giving me a lecture that this is a Western concept. So go tell your Egyptian women that this is a Western concept. So the point I'm making is that very often when you hear these statements, you hear this mainly from perpetrators of human rights violations. That statement never comes from the victims. So I'll stop there.
So I'm curious about both of your thoughts about integrating human rights values within human rights organizations. We've seen periodically the news of large international NGOs or human rights organizations where people in leadership positions have been accused of various violations of people's rights, whether it's labor issues or it's sexual harassment. Embezzlement of money that is meant for, relief and for situations where people are very vulnerable, like Ebola relief. How can the human rights movement best ensure accountability and adoption of sort of standards within its own institutions to ensure that the movement is kind of internally reflecting what it advocates externally?
Are you going first, Aminta, or do you want me to?
I mean, I can go first to say that I don't have the answer, but then this gives me the opportunity to go onto one of my soapboxes, which I will take gladly, which is the issue of diversity in the field, particularly for some of the institutions we're talking about. So the international institutions in particular. I personally have been championing this issue because I think it speaks to the legitimacy of human rights and of the organizations that are pushing for human rights. When you have perpetrators who are saying human rights is only a Western thing, it's hard to actually combat that argument when everyone who is speaking to them about human rights from that institution is themselves Western. So there is a legitimacy aspect of where diversity comes in, but also I think diversity is a value in its own right. And we've seen in cases of whistleblowers, for example, in different organizations, a lot of times they tend to be people who are not from the dominant identity of the organization. So that helps in terms of accountability. But I also think we know that diverse organizations perform better. They're better at performing. So, the scholarship from business and from organizational behavior shows that diverse organizations tend to be more innovative and productive. There's greater worker satisfaction, which I think is something that we can take into our human rights organizations wherever they are. And then also that when you have underrepresented voices in a place, underrepresented issues are then raised. And there's been a lot of work on this, on gender, for example, the role of women in political processes, that women are the ones who often are bringing up policies that relate to social welfare and the protection of minorities. So I think that the same is likely to happen if we ensure that diversity is one of the key values of human rights organizations.
Thank you, Aminta. I think I think in practice, Sushma, these issues are more kind of afflict large operational organizations like humanitarian and development organizations more than human rights groups. Not to say that human rights organizations don't have issues. I can tell you, having been in one for 8 years, there's no shortage of issues inside Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. It's a long list, and but not. I don't think they're quite in the same way that I think like all those Ebola type stuff, etc. That's not quite what we had to face. I think the challenge that I face personally inside Amnesty is when you're trying to do like power shifts. So when you say diversity, as Aminta is saying, like if you want to shift the decision making power from the north to the south, or you want to make it more diverse, because that would mean that it's not going to be all white men or women primarily, then the same people who are lecturing you on all these good things about human rights, they suddenly start finding very complex excuses to not wanting to let go of their own power, and that becomes quite an awkward conversation and a very tough conversation. So we've had some very difficult times in Amnesty. We made the kind of possibly the biggest change process that any large human rights organization has seen. We went through it over a period of 4 or 5 years, and it was a transformative process, but a very painful process. And that's, to me, that's a power shift. The pain it was, and yeah. So values are kind of part of that, because when we say values, it's not just about financial integrity, but it's also about intellectual integrity. And that was very painful. And I think there's no shortcut to it. It will happen. I mean, because that classic thing that if you're a white guy going to work in Africa, you're considered an expatriate. If it's the other way around, you're a refugee, right? So if a developing country person comes to a rich country, they're a refugee or a migrant. Whereas if the same white guy goes to Africa, they're considered an expatriate. So that is kind of the reality of the world we live in. And it'll change. It's just going to be a bit slower.
So as we're looking ahead to 2021, we are deeply steeped, countries around the world are deeply steeped in the midst of the pandemic, and different countries have, different levels of responses on the part of their governments. And we've seen income inequality become far more exacerbated during the past few months, with the net worth of billionaires increasing rapidly during this period. And, a lot of people who are informal sector workers, or in the US, what people are being called as essential workers, being affected. So, if you were to identify, 3 to 4 kind of priorities for the human rights movement for the coming year, what would they be given this context?
This is tough. This is tough. I mean, I think in my own perspective, I can't say priorities for the whole movement, but I can say priorities for what I think I want to spend my time on, which are the topics that I opened with. So what is affecting people in the workplace? I think that's a really big driver of inequality. Like you mentioned, on informal workers and people who are in precarious work of all kinds. We have gig workers in the US, and you might have, self-employed street vendors in other countries, which are facing the fact that they're outside of the formal employment system and the protections that are afforded there. So that's something that I passionately want to keep working on. Obviously, the climate change, I think, is clearly going to affect all of us, and is already affecting us. So I think this is a priority, and I think that human rights organizations have already made it a priority. So I think that's actually a smart move in that regard. And then I think the right to health, I think that to me is also another one, which clearly is impacted by COVID-19, but it's the weaknesses that we have in our different systems were already there, in terms of people being able to access healthcare and to have a full life. So I think right to health would be something else that I think is important.
So I would say, Sushma, in my head, that in a sense, what is needed is a little bit of shift from protection to kind of prevention and promotion. That the balance between all those different aspects, if you take all the elements of what human rights organizations do, there is a very strong focus on protection and kind of after the event action, but like both preventive stuff and promotional stuff. When I say promotion, I'm talking about human rights education, for example, trying to get, because I mean, societies have become so polarized, and that, children are being fed with such, I mean, if you go to rural parts of India, the poison that young people are being fed through WhatsApp and YouTube and stuff like that. I'm saying countering all this sort of fake news and, violent news is human rights education in its kind of broadest sense. I would say that would be a very high priority for me. Because, if you think of how do you bring about economic justice, that's not rocket science, right? I mean, we know what needs to happen. The question is, how do you make it happen? So, I mean, if you ask me what are the 4 or 5 things which are the most obvious things, so you have kind of on the stock side, there's a kind of physical capital and then there's the human capital. So you need to make sure that people have access to both kind of physical capital, where the means of production, employment, whatever, how they live. And you need to have better access to health and education and all the human capital side. So that's kind of on the stock, so to say. And then all the flows, because, whether it's income tax, progressive taxation, social safety nets, all of that. And finally, quotas and reservations. So, I mean, any of us could design a set of policies which are the right mix for a country or for a society to do. How do you make it happen is that's a political process. Now, that's where it's much more complex, because things have got so polarized. So, what is the role of the human rights movement in this is because some of this is way out of depth of human rights organizations to engage in. But, in the Amnesty case, whenever we've dealt with economic, social, cultural rights, campaigns, etc., we have pushed the boundary and talked about, what kind of budgets government should put into these, what kind of investments are required. There are, economic social committee recommendations and all of this. How do you prioritize? What's the minimum threshold? So some of those tools do exist, and they can do a lot more. I think people are a bit hesitant to get into this whole economic space, but I think there's no choice. We have to.
So by way of concluding, let me ask you just one final question, and actually kind of takes its cues from where Salil, you just ended up with the economic space. So one of the big developments in the human rights world in the last 15 years or so has been that whole domain of human rights and business. And my colleague here at the Kennedy School, John Ruggie, was a pioneer there when you worked with Kofi Annan as the Secretary General of the United Nations to really have a good way of thinking about the human rights obligations of business, and especially international corporations, which often are much more powerful than many of the smaller states, smaller countries. And so, and a key theme there was, so when the UN implemented, at least passed the principles on human rights and business, one key idea was a due diligence idea all the way down the supply chain. So you can no longer say we are Nike, we don't sell shoes, we sell an idea of urban cool, and other people make shoes, right? So you have a due diligence all the way down in the supply chain, and it's a major innovation in the human rights world to really hold businesses to human rights standards. And so my concluding question for you on this topic of economic space: how is that going from what you are seeing? What is your kind of temporary, as of now, assessment of what's happening in the human rights and business world? And maybe I start with you, Aminta, and then turn back to Salil, and then we'll conclude.
Yes, no, ironically, I don't have a very strong perspective on the business and human rights frame for things. When I work on workers' rights, the thing that jumped out at me is the idea that many workers are outside of business. And so a lot of them, so some of the business and human rights protections that we push for they can apply within a corporate space, but if you're just a self-employed, let's say you're a waste picker or you're a domestic worker who employs yourself, then you cannot be protected by the business and human rights framework. And I think most workers in the world are falling in this category. So I would want to supplement the priorities of business and human rights with also looking at those who are outside of the business structure. I do have colleagues who work on business and human rights very closely, and I think one critique that they have raised is about communities not being fully represented in the business and human rights framework. So those are just some perspectives that I know of.
So I am a little bit optimistic on that one, Mathias. I mean, like if you take the issue of labor rights in Qatar, for example, a campaign on which I worked very closely, you may have heard that, they actually made some very important announcements in the last 2 months or so. I mean, they scrapped the kafala system, which, essentially did not allow people to change employers without permission from the government. They've introduced minimum wages, a bunch of things which we have been asking for. We worked with ITUC and using the FIFA World Cup as a kind of opportunity to push for this. And we saw the results. It took about 3-4 years of pretty sustained campaigning, and we've seen the results of that. I was also personally involved in the whole issue of the use of child labor by Apple in the Democratic Republic of Congo in relation to lithium-ion batteries. You're probably aware that DRC is one of the, I think 40% of the world's cobalt comes from DRC. And that was a classic case where, the human rights due diligence and the supply chain was simply not working. And it was fascinating because Tim Cook, who is the current CEO of Apple, was the head of supply chain during the time of Steve Jobs. So at the time when we met him and explained to him as to what is happening in relation to child labor and the phones, which the batteries which were in the Apple phones, I don't think they even had fully realized how serious the issue was. And then, I mean, I don't know what the latest is, but they had moved a long way in cleaning up that whole issue of the supply chain. And it's a tricky one because obviously you don't want to be in a situation where all the children are suddenly asked to leave, and which means their families will all collapse. So it had to be done in a slightly steady, sustained way. But I would say that where the light has been shown on these companies, they have moved, and a lot of it is about putting public pressure and public campaigning. It's not just appealing to their good hearts. I think it's more than that. And so in a sense that you asked a 2-part question earlier, Mathias, about is all this making a difference? So I don't want us to end in a kind of a negative or cynical note. I think that there is no question that the only thing that makes a difference is when people stand up, and human rights organizations are there behind them to support them. But we are seeing change in so many parts of the world, from Belarus to Thailand to Hong Kong to Chile and Argentina. So to suggest that these things are not making a difference is just not true.
And then on that note, it's time to wrap up our conversation on human rights and economic justice. Thank you both, Aminta and Salil, for joining us. And thank you for our audience. We have a couple of events tomorrow hosted by our fellows, as well as a continuation of this series next week on reparations. So thank you to our audience for joining us as well.